Good morning, all of you. My name is Sushant, and today we will be going to discuss the paper 1 section A of political science optional, which was asked in mains 2021. Okay, and if you see the nature of the paper, okay, I'm sure that a student who has well prepared, who has done a comprehensive study of the syllabus, and that student would be very comfortable in answering all the questions. And as we say, to all our students in the class, that our purpose is to ensure that all our students are spoilt with the choices, that which all questions to attempt. And I'm sure if you have gone through the paper, you would feel the same way. Okay. So as I say, UPSC has asked a very standard question as far as paper 1 is concerned. Now, before we move on to discuss the nature of the paper, I would like to focus on the approach which you should take while answering the paper. Okay. Now, this has been our repeated theme in the classroom discussions which we have had, that if you want to score good marks in the paper, the first and the primary requirement is that you have to understand the demand of the question. Okay. And if you see the very nature of UPSC optional examination is different from that of a university examination. Here, as I often say, the time is limited, the space is also limited, and you will be evaluated on the basis of what you write actually in those 180 minutes. And the key theme is to understand the demand of the question. Okay. So if I say the very first important requirement is to understand the demand of the question. To understand the demand of the question, that what the examiner expects from you. And trust me, if you understand the demand of the question, certainly 50% of your task is complete. And as I often have been saying in the class, that the next 50% is about having a good structure of the answer, keeping in mind the requirements of the question. Okay. So 50% task is first to understand the demand of the question. The rest 50% is to have a proper structure, of the answer. And in both the cases, what helps us to understand the demand of the question as well as the proper structure, that are the keywords, identification of the keywords which has been asked in the question, along with their relation between them. So identification of the keywords along with relation, that is what helps us to understand both the demand of the question as well as the proper structure of the answer. Now keywords, if you see the question, sometimes a statement has been given, or sometimes a quotation has been given, and in light of that quotation you have to understand the demand of the question. Okay. And if you find that to understand the demand of the question, every question which has been put in the paper, or if you have go through the previous year's paper, you will find that UPSC starts with most of the times UPSC starts with the question tags. UPSC starts with the question tags basically. And as I say, every optional has its own keywords which is asked in the question and which also shall be reflected in the answer. How? Let us see. Now, these question tags, we will find that suppose the very first question, short notes, most of the time it starts with the word comment. Okay. Now, when we starts with the word comment, or sometimes there are words like explain. Okay. Sometimes there are words like explain, or sometimes there are words like, do you agree? Do you agree? Critically analyze, etc. Critically analyze, etc. Okay. Now, if we, for example, we discuss comment, I'm sure some of you must be sports fan. Okay. So if you see the commentary, so suppose if I take the example of cricket, now in commentary, the commentator says, the commentator gives his views, and commentator basically what he proceeds is a comprehensive analysis of the sports. Okay. Suppose if the batsman has played a shot, the commentator will give a comprehensive analysis, and in this comprehensive analysis, the commentator will basically give both sides, that is from the bowler perspective as well as from a batsman perspective, from a fielder perspective also. So a comprehensive analysis. The ball has been bowled, whether it is a shot of a length ball, whether it is a full toss. The batsman has played a shot, which type of shot it is, etc., and how it has been fielded well or not. Okay. So you have to keep in mind that when the question comment comes, it basically asks about the comprehensive analysis. It basically, what the examiner wants to know from you is basically the comprehensive analysis. Comprehensive analysis, it means both sides of the divide, for and against, the prospects and consequences as well. So this is comprehensive analysis, and that's what you have to highlight in that. If I say questions like explain, that question tags like explain and do you agree. So here you have to give a detailed description of the concept and issue. Now what is the difference between comment and explain is that in comment you present the prospects as well as consequences. That is not required in the term explain. Explanation is about the explaining the concept itself, detailed description of the concept only. If the question talks about do you agree, the relation between the keywords, if I say the relation between the keywords, it will help you to understand the demand of the question, and that's how you have to proceed accordingly. Now, as far as structure of the answer is concerned, you have to keep one fact in mind, that this is a conventional essay type paper where you will be have a proper structure of the answer. Structure means there shall be introduction. Structure means there has to be a main body. Introduction, main body, and structure means there has to be a conclusion also. This is the appropriate structure with which you are expected to proceed. Introduction, main body, and conclusion. And sometimes you will find that question has 2 or 3 parts. And what shall be the weightage of these 2 or 3 parts, that you have to have a mental weightage. It can be 70-30, 80-20, or 60-40. So while writing the answer, the main body basically, you have to address the different parts of the questions. Address different parts of the question. If you are not addressing all the parts of the questions, basically your answer will be incomplete, and accordingly you will not get good marks. Basically your marks will also be incomplete. Okay. And so basically introduction, main body, and conclusion. Now sometimes students say that we are not able to get a world class introduction, world class conclusion. There is no need for it. As I tell you, the time limit is there, and the first and foremost objective of the student shall be attempting the entire paper. If you are not attempting the entire paper, this is the challenge. I must have often told you in the class that the first and the most important challenge is to finish the entire paper. If you are losing, not able to complete the paper, 2 questions, 3 questions, it means it becomes very tough for you, and how it diminishes your chances of success. Virtually you are out of the race, I will say. Okay. So Here the time limit, if I say for a 10 marks question, I've already 15 marks question, and for a 20 marks question, the time limit for you to attempt is 7 minutes approx for this 10 marks question. For a 15 marks question, 10 minutes, and for a 20 marks question, broadly 15 minutes. This is a rough, time distribution. Okay, and that's how it helps you to attempt the entire paper. Regarding the word limits, in the compulsory questions, question 1 and question 5, 10 markers, UPSC has prescribed the word limit of 150 words. In rest of the 15 markers and 20 markers, the word limit is not prescribed, but we can make an intelligent guess. Intelligent guess meaning, here we find that if the 10 marks question is of 150 words, automatically the 20 marks question, it boils down to 300 to 350 words. That 15 markers, you can write it in form of 200 to 250 words. The word limit is not hard and fast except in the 10 markers question, where question number 1 and question number 5, section A, the first question of section A and section B respectively, UPSC mentions that you have to write within 150 words. And you have to stick to the word limit in order to be able to attempt the entire paper. So word limit, time limit, both are important, and obviously that distinguishes the main examination from a conventional university examination. Okay. Now, with this background, let us start with the discussion of the paper which was asked in Mains 2021. And I'm sure, those students who attended our classes and those who have read well, conditions applied again, they must be very comfortable in seeing the questions, in attempting the questions, and you will agree with me that nearly all came from our notes, class notes, and that will help you to answer the question. Okay. So now, as we have proceeded in the class, let us start with the discussion of the first. And if you see the first question, which is a compulsory question, you can see the word here used is comment. Okay, and it talks about the feminist. It talks about the feminist critique of the state. Okay, feminist critique of the state. So how have feminists, they have criticized the state? And as I said that the keywords, identification of the keywords here, feminist critique of the state, or simply we can say feminist critique is one keyword, and of the state. So three keywords here: comment, feminist critique, and the state. Draw the relationship among these three keywords, and that's what helps you to understand the demand of the question. If I have to paraphrase in simple words, we can say the examiner wants you to write about the feminist critique of the state. Okay. Now, here we find, let us see what is the structure of the answer. Okay. Now in introduction, you can write about straight away. It's a 150 words question. You have to not waste any time or word, and straight away, from the very first word go, you have to hit the nail on its head. So we find that we can start with the introduction, that the feminists have usually not regarded the nature of the state. It is said, feminists have usually not regarded the nature of the state as a central theme. They have largely focused on the deeper structures of patriarchy. However, we find that there are certain feminist perspective of the state, how feminists have criticized the state. And here the very first point, what was Max Weber's definition of the state. That state is that human association which has the monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in a given territory. So that view of the state of Weber is questioned by the feminists. They say that no, this monopoly of legitimate violence is not with the state, but that what also happens within the family. Okay, so this violence against women also happens within the family. Okay, violence, intimidation also happens within the family. And then you have to discuss the then you have to discuss the view of the socialist feminist, for example. Now both socialist and radical feminists, they have questioned the neutrality of the state. They have questioned the neutrality of the state given by liberal feminists. That state is a neutral arbiter among the different competing interests. They basically say that the state is not a neutral arbiter, state is biased in favor of men. And socialist feminists, if you see, socialist feminists, they criticize the welfare state. On which ground they criticize the welfare state? That was I had included, if you are able to recall, I had included it in the material itself. Okay. Now, if you see the material which was given to you all, okay. Now, socialist feminists have attacked the liberal state on many grounds. If you see, the welfare policies of the Western capitalist state, it increases women's dependence on men within the capitalist mode of production. How women constitute as the reserve army of labor, we have discussed. How it tends to serve men's interest by maintaining women's unpaid labor in the home. So unpaid labor in the home is maintained by the state's policies. And how after discussing of socialist feminists, we have to discuss the radical feminist view. And in radical feminist view, you see, in radical feminist view, we find that obviously there are two views of radical feminist. First is the instrumentalist view as well as the structuralist view. The instrumentalist view, which considers the state as an instrument, it is a tool of men to defend and uphold the structure of patriarchy. How through the institutions of the state women's subordination is maintained. And radical feminists have given the slogan of personal is political, where politics is considered as power structured relationship. One group dominates the other. Okay, so how Catherine Mackinnon, for example, she emphasizes that it is through the laws of the state, that subordination of women is maintained. She says that the law is capitalist for the same reason law is patriarchal. What Marxists say, that law is basically capitalist. So here how Catherine Mackinnon pointed out, we have discussed in the class, how she says that the law privileges the interest of men. How the law allows, it sees women the way men see them. And she gives the example of abortion law also. Abortion law, basically, why abortion is allowed? Because it enables women to engage in heterosexual activity once abortion is done. So the law always privileges men viewpoint. State is run by men for men. It's an how through the laws of the state women's domination is maintained. This is instrumentalist perspective. The structuralist perspective basically emphasize how the institution of the state is embedded in the wider patriarchal system. If I say the institution of the state is embedded in the wider patriarchal system, and particularly the welfare state. The how radical feminists have criticized that the welfare state has shifted the basically the private dependence to public dependence, where women are dependent on the state as a client, where state is a service provider, like nutrition, Anganwadi schemes, we can say state provides nutrition to women, or as an employer. Okay, so this is about instrumentalist perspective as well as the structuralist perspective of the state. Okay, but here liberal feminists emphasize that state can also be used to provide equal opportunities and rights to women. The way right to vote has been extended, the way right to property has been extended to women, the right to divorce has been extended. Okay, so while liberal feminists emphasize on the neutrality of the state, how state can be used as an instrument to secure the equal rights for women in the public sphere, that is questioned by the socialist and the radical feminists. And one line you can write about the difference feminists who argue from an essentialist perspective. That difference feminists who argue from the essentialist perspective, where the difference feminists basically emphasize that the dominance of men in the power structure has basically led to environmental degradation. Ecofeminism we have discussed. So here you are providing all the dimensions, and then in conclusion you can say that how the feminist theory, one line conclusion, the feminist critique has enriched the perspective about the state, has enriched the concept of the state. Simple line. Okay, so this is about the first feminist critique of the state. Let us see the second question. Now if you see the second question talks about the affirmative action. Second question talks about the affirmative action, and this was an expected question, the broad context in which that question was asked. If you see the debates which have been going around, there is a demand for caste census. Cases were filed in Supreme Court regarding OBC reservation and EWS reservation in NEET exam. Okay, so broadly that was about affirmative action, so this question was expected. Now affirmative action. Now affirmative action basically, what shall be the structure? Now structure is introduction. If I talk about in introduction, you have to first define what is affirmative action, and then you have to, if you see the structure I have drawn, what shall be the structure of the answer? Now here you find, now affirmative action, okay, straight away start with the definition of affirmative action. And the definition of affirmative action, that it's basically a policy of it is defined as the formal effort to provide increased it is formal effort to provide increased employment and educational opportunities. So it is a formal effort to provide increased employment and educational opportunities for the historically disadvantaged sections of the society, in order to ensure that they also come at par with the other sections of the society. So simply start with the definition of affirmative action. Affirmative action, then you can include affirmative action as a part of the equality of opportunity, which talks about equalizing initial conditions. It talks about equalizing initial conditions. And affirmative action, it is to ensure justice for historic deprivation. Okay, you can include how the historically disadvantaged section, ST, SC, women and blacks, they have been given the affirmative action. Then you have to, in the main body, you have to basically emphasize on few aspects, like how the affirmative action invokes the idea of fairness, how it is different from the preferential policy, where preferential policy, one line, where preferential policy is generally given to the dominant, it is generally given to the dominant ethnic majority or minority, like Sinhalas in Sri Lanka. Here it is not dominant ethnic majority or minority, but who are historically deprived section. Just one line. And then you have two arguments for and against affirmative action. On which ground affirmative action is supported and on which ground affirmative action is objected to. And if you see the material, that was clearly included in the material. Now if you see, this is the material on feminism. Now here affirmative action, the grounds, the arguments for affirmative action. Now if you see the arguments for affirmative action, it says why affirmative action is needed, because it is said there is need to compensate, there is a need to compensate for the loss, how they have been historically disadvantaged. It fulfills the objective of equality and social justice, and how it is also justified on the basis of need. The allocation shall not be only on the basis of merit but also on the basis of need. So one line on including these 3 points, that how affirmative action is justified. To compensate for the loss, to ensure the objective of equality and social justice, as well as on the basis of need. And straight away you can then include arguments against affirmative action. And here also, while writing the answer, you have to keep in mind that certain keywords shall also be there. Every optional has its own language. I've been emphasizing in the class. And that too, while answering the question, you have to emphasize on the keywords. Here keywords, for example, it leads to the debate on reverse discrimination, that one form of discrimination substituting the other. It's a violation of procedural justice, another keyword. Okay, and how it's a violation of procedural justice, how it is object at the social cost, how it is said that the creamy layer, the advantaged sections among the deprived, they corner all the benefits, and the benefits are not, they could not reach those who are the most needy sections. In one line, you have to, 1 or 2 lines basically, you have to emphasize this arguments against affirmative action. And in conclusion, basically you can give the views of scholars. If I say Ashokacharya had said that reservation is definitely needed for empowerment, but it is justified in morally compelling cases, to ensure that the benefits of reservation needs to the most deserving ones. You can write 1 or 2 lines also relating it to the, if you see the Supreme Court judgment, recent Supreme Court judgment, where Supreme Court had said reservation and merit, Supreme Court upheld the OBC reservation in the NEET examination. Supreme Court said reservation and merit are not opposites. So you can conclude with 1 line by including any contemporary developments also. Okay, this is about affirmative action. The third question, the third short notes talks about the third short notes talks about equality of outcome as a political idea. Okay, now equality of outcome as a political idea. Identify the again keywords. Equality of outcome as a political idea. And you have to comment. So you have to basically, in the introduction, you have to define straight away, without wasting any word. You have to straight away write in the introduction how the equality of outcome leads to, basically it reveals a fundamental ideological divide, where socialist and some anarchist and communist, they support a certain measure of social equality is important, while on the other hand modern liberals and conservatives, they oppose it as more immoral. So straight away in the introduction, if you see the structure of this answer, and structure of this answer, you find in introduction, basically I have said that its most radical and controversial phase of egalitarianism, its most radical and comprehensive phase of egalitarianism, and it reveals a fundamental ideological divide between socialist, communist and semi-anarchist on one hand versus conservatives and liberals on the other hand. They support that some measure of social equality is required, they oppose. So straight away in introduction, you have hinted how its quality of outcome is a political idea. And then you have to say that how, next you have to explain how it shifts attention from the end result to chances or rewards, where this outcome is understood as, if you see, this outcome is basically understood as, it is basically understood in terms of either material equality, in terms of social circumstances, in terms of equality of living conditions, or possibly even wages. This was given in the material. So how outcome is visualized, is understood as material equality, social circumstances, living conditions and possibly even wages. Okay. So outcome in terms of rewards. And then you have to explain the justification, that is the arguments for and the arguments against. Okay. In 2-3 lines you have to explain. That those who support the justification, it's a most vital form of equality. Recall idea of Karl Marx. Karl Marx had said that the way formal equality is supported by the bourgeois, it is basically a right to unequal, and without measure of legal, without a measure of social equality, legal and political equality is meaningless. So it's a most vital form of equality, and you find that it is the most vital form of equality. And second, they criticize equality of opportunity. What Tony says, equality of opportunity is nothing but a tadpole philosophy. They argue that it is a precondition for securing individual liberty. Equality of opportunity also ensures social harmony and stability. Okay. So arguments for that, why they give they support equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, and they are critical of equality of opportunity. They give these arguments. And if you see, the against argument is given by the new right thinkers Hayek and Keith Joseph. Hayek, for example, said individuals differ in talent, skills and abilities that results to inequality. Any attempt at equality, it will lead to stagnation. If you see the material, it basically talks about any attempt to equality. Now criticism, you can see how we discussed that they say that it leads to tyranny, it leads to ultimately tyranny, and talent is penalized. How it acts as a disincentive. Hayek and Keith Joseph, they have criticized equality of outcome. Hayek says people differ in talents, they have different aspirations, and any attempt at equality of outcome will lead to violation of liberty. And here Keith Joseph talked about Aristotle's concept of proportionate equality, where treating equals unequally or unequals equally is violation of justice. Okay. So Aristotle's concept of proportionate equality you have to write. And obviously in conclusion, if we have to ask about conclusion, now in conclusion you can simply add that equality of outcome, okay, the moderate supporters of equality of outcome, they have emphasized on the need of a proper incentive along with social equality. Moderate supporters, I am saying. So with this equality of outcome, you can explain this. Coming to the next question. Now next question, question number 1D. Now 1D talks about tools of legitimation of the state. It is about tools of, if you see the keywords, it talks about tools of legitimation of the state. So basically, what is this statement means? It talks about the legitimation process. It talks about the legitimation process, how the state achieves legitimacy. What are the tools which the state uses to achieve legitimacy? This is simply the question. Okay. Now, if you have to proceed as far as introduction is concerned, you can straight away basically define legitimacy. Definition of legitimacy. Legitimacy is considered as rightfulness. It is that quality which transforms naked power into authority, where people voluntarily, willingly obey the commands out of a sense of duty. Okay, so this is in introduction. You can straight away start with definition of legitimacy. Okay, and if you see how legitimacy is achieved by the state, through which tools, that how legitimation process achieved. In that context, you have to commonsensical view is that legitimacy has to be seen in terms of two dimensions: internal legitimacy and external legitimacy. How internal legitimacy is maintained, how external legitimacy is maintained. So if you see the structure of the answer, we find here now. So straight away I said you can start with definition of legitimacy. What is the legitimacy? In main body, you have to focus on, if you see in main body I have emphasized you have to focus on two dimensions of legitimation process, that how internal legitimacy is achieved and how external legitimacy is achieved. If I talk about external legitimacy, you must be aware about Taliban. How Taliban has been trying to get legitimacy in the eyes of international community. So this external legitimacy, it says, it recognizes, the external legitimacy basically means the recognition which the states give to one another, and it allows them to self-identity as a distinct political entity. How this recognition is achieved is by post-war peace conferences. It's a tool for the state to get international legitimacy. The post-war peace conferences, starting with the concept of state, Treaty of Westphalia we have discussed, 1648, Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Okay, so here international legitimacy is achieved by the state through the post-war peace conferences. International legitimacy is also achieved by state through international agreements. International agreements. For example, you must have discussed the concept of humanitarian intervention. How humanitarian intervention is justified on the basis of R2P principle, responsibility to protect. So military intervention in the affairs of another state is justified on the ground of international agreements and principles, the R2P principle, or when it is sanctioned by the action of the Security Council. That is tools of legitimacy of the state in the external sphere. As far as internal sphere is concerned, now David Beetham in his book The Legitimation of Power, he said legitimacy is achieved if it is based off three principles. These are three principles of the legitimation process. First, if you see, power is exercised according to established rules and procedures. Second, these rules must be justified in terms of shared beliefs of the rulers and the ruled. And third, rule is based on the popular consent. Okay. So this is how David Beetham, he said that the state has to achieve legitimacy. It has to be on the basis of three principles, 1, 2 and 3. And then what is the mechanism which is achieved by the state to achieve that? Now keep in mind the three principles. If you find, the first mechanism is constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, basically it gives the broad structure of the state. Basically stands for limited power, and the states use the provisions of the constitution to achieve legitimacy. Whenever a coup takes place, you find that the constitution is either suspended or a new constitution is promulgated, and they try to legitimize themselves that my rule is according to the new constitution. Myanmar's junta, it formulated a new constitution in 2014. Okay. Now second, there is the assessment of the people about the fairness of the decision making process, that whatever decisions has been taken, these decisions must be seen as fair in the eyes of the people. And here Tom Tyler says, more than the substance of the decision, it is the procedures by which they are made that produce legitimacy. So how the state can ensure legitimacy of its decisions? By ensuring that proper rules are followed. I say these rules must be based on the shared beliefs of the rulers and the ruled. So basically it is in the image of the public. How? It is in the image of the public. How? You have to understand that this decision making procedure is seen to be fair, and the tools to achieve it, you find. Just a second. Okay, and the tools, basically I'm again emphasizing that Tom Tyler says that more than the substance, it is a procedure by which the decisions are made that has to be appear as reasonable to the people. So the fairness of the decision making procedure, and here you find the tools to achieve it is public consultation, propaganda. Public consultation, you must be reading in newspapers, there is an advertisement by the parliamentary committees which examine certain bills, where they invite public suggestions from the different stakeholders. Civil society, consultations with civil society organizations, civil society members are also a tool to ensure this legitimation process. Propaganda is important. I hope you are able to recall the idea of Aristotle. Okay, when Aristotle talked about equality and consensus. Okay, so decisions shall be taken after consultation with all the citizens. He emphasized this point. So public consultation and propaganda is the tools to ensure that the decision making process seems to be fair to the public. The next we find the rule based on popular consent. How the consent is taken from the public? It is through periodic elections, a referendum and plebiscites. I would like to mention, for example, Brexit. Brexit, the British government justified its decision to leave European Union on the basis of a referendum in which majority of the population of Britain, they supported that yes, Britain should exit European Union. Now, so process, no, this is elections also, how they legitimize the rules. And any dictator, he tries to invoke democratic procedures to get the legitimacy. Okay. Now, you must be aware of the CPC, Chinese Communist Party, 100 years of establishment of Chinese Communist Party. National People's Congress was called, and how they approved, they stamped that yes, Xi Jinping can have unlimited terms. They gave him the title of the supreme leader. Basically, they emphasized that Xi Jinping is there as the supreme leader of the China. So that is how he endorsed his candidature through the representatives of the people, NPC, National People's Congress. Now here, by securing the welfare of the subjects, and this securing the welfare of the subjects, law and order, welfare policies and relief measures. Remember, in fact, in Kautilya's Arthashastra also, Kautilya talks about that you have to ensure Raksha Palan. The king has to ensure Raksha Palan, because if king does not ensure, people will be angry with him and they may side with his enemy to topple him. So Kautilya had also talked about this procedure. In fact, Aristotle, he also talks about the image of the government is very important when he discusses the causes of remedies and revolutions. Okay, and so it seems to be beneficial in the interest of the people, and how this consent, you can also write one line about Gramsci's hegemony. Gramsci's hegemony is like Stephen Luke's radical view of power, shaping of the perceptions. How the consent is generated by the institutions of civil society. Okay, so this is about how the state, the legitimation process, basically the tools of legitimation of the state. And in conclusion, you can write that if the state legitimacy is lost, it leads to what Habermas said, it leads to legitimation crisis. Okay, so in one line you have to conclude with the legitimation crisis of Habermas. Coming to the next question. Now this next question is about J.S. Mill's ideas. It talks about J.S. Mill's ideas on women's suffrage. J.S. Mill's ideas on women suffrage. So what were the ideas of J.S. Mill as far as women's suffrage is concerned? Now this idea is about how J.S. Mill, what were the views of J.S. Mill as far as women's right to vote is concerned. And if you see, the proper structure of this question would be, if I say first is introduction. An introduction, you can straight away write with that J.S. Mill was the first among political philosophers to talk about equal rights of women. He was the first among political philosophers to talk about equal rights of women. And that idea he gave in his book, The Subjection of Women. You can also talk about how his inspiration was his wife Harriet Taylor. So after Plato, J.S. Mill was the first modern thinker who talked about the equal rights of the women. And then you have to discuss the grounds of justification, on which ground J.S. Mill justified women's right to vote. The first ground, he talked about that every individual is the best judge of his or her interest. And to protect his or her interest, what is needed is participation. And on that ground, women should also be allowed to participate in the political process, because it enables them to protect their interest. The first justification. Second justification, how he talked about that, it's very paradoxical. Remember, he said that we were in mid 19th century England, if you see the context, was that the women were denied right to vote, they were denied right over their children, they were denied right to property, all her property belonged to her husband. So women were in a very subordinate position. So writing in that context, J.S. Mill said that it is indeed paradoxical that we demand liberty, equality and justice in the public sphere, political sphere, but the same is denied to women in the private sphere, that is sphere of the family, and it is indeed paradoxical. So to remove this paradox, we need to extend same principles of liberal justice and equality to women, and that is how it also means right to vote. Third is utility factor. J.S. Mill, as a utilitarian, he talked about utility in all his ideas. And utility we find, he talks about it is in utility of democratic citizenship, that how it will strengthen democracy, how the child who learns in his family that women are equal will also be able to associate with the citizens in an equal manner. It talks about satisfying the greatest happiness principle, that if right to vote is extended to women, this will lead to the happiness of the one half of the humanity, and accordingly it will satisfy the utilitarian principle of greatest happiness of the greatest number. Better positive position to influence humanity. Women as legislators, obviously they will add another element. Okay. So here we find democratic citizenship, satisfying the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, if you see, so on these grounds you have to justify utility ground, in grounds of paradoxical, in grounds of participation, he justified women's right to vote. In conclusion, you can simply say, now in conclusion you can simply say, you can write Hawkins' view, Susan Moller Hawkins' view, that is Mill's view on women's suffrage were a great contribution to champions women's right, and as a member of parliament he even had presented a bill in the parliament for that purpose which could not be passed. So Mill was progressive in his idea as far as women's right to equality is concerned. Okay. So basically that is what you have to write. If you see the structure of the answer, introduction, main body and conclusion, you have to write these things. Now coming to the next question, and if you see the next question, the next question is about the very first question. How has Rawls enriched the idea of justice in the liberalism? How has Rawls enriched the idea of justice in liberalism? So basically, it talks about the question, if I have to paraphrase in another words, it's about contribution of John Locke. It's about contribution of John Locke in, John Rawls, not John Locke. It is about contribution of John Rawls in enriching the idea of justice in liberalism. So if I say, what shall be the introduction? Now this question is of two parts, I will say. The answer to this question lies in two parts. The first part, you have to briefly discuss what was the idea of justice. Idea of justice in liberalism. You have to first discuss what is the idea of justice in liberalism before John Rawls came. And then focus more on what was the Rawls's contribution. Focus more on what has been Rawls's contribution. So in introduction, you can discuss about what is the idea of justice in liberalism, very short. And then you can focus more on what was the Rawls's contribution. Now, if you see the structure of the answer, And here, so you have to first start with the first part, as I say, define justice, where justice is a moral standard of fairness and impartiality, and straight away briefly discuss the liberal notion of justice. And keep in mind that this is a 20 marks question. Okay. So in introduction you have to discuss about liberal notion of justice. Then only you will be able to emphasize or know how, what was the view of justice prevailing earlier, what addition, what enrichment John Rawls did to liberal theory of justice. Okay. So here liberal notion of justice, as we have discussed in classes, liberal notion of justice is based on equalities of belief in equality of various kind. The first is foundational equality, equal moral worth of all individuals. It also talks about the foundational equality, talks about equal moral worth of all individuals. Foundational equality also talks about the formal equality. Formal equality, where legal and political equality, equality before law, one person, one vote, one value. Okay, this is about equality. And it talks about equality of opportunity, where equality of opportunity talks about a meritocratic society, right to reward merit and the ability to work hard. It emphasizes on a belief in meritocracy. And here, as far as equality of opportunity is considered, there is a difference in the opinion between classical liberals and modern liberals. Classical liberals and modern liberals. Classical liberals, they emphasize on the concept of strict meritocracy. Strict meritocracy, they justify it on the basis of economic grounds. There is a need of incentive to be given. They emphasize on the need of incentive to be given. They also emphasize on moral grounds, treating equals equally, unequals unequally. Whereas as far as modern liberals is concerned, modern liberals, they say modern liberals have emphasized on the notion of social justice. Modern liberals have emphasized on the notion of social justice. That's how social justice is needed. Okay, they've emphasized on the notion of social justice. That's how social justice implies a measure of social equality. Social justice implies a measure of social equality is needed. So this difference between emphasis on equality of opportunity as far as the classical liberals is concerned and modern liberals is concerned. Modern liberals have emphasized on the notion of social justice, which includes a kind of social equality. And here John Rawls is considered as a modern liberal. To be specific, he was a social liberal. Okay. So in that background, where you have already positioned what was a liberal notion of justice, you introduce John Rawls. So John Rawls will be a modern liberal. So this much you have to write in the introductory part. And then straight away you have to emphasize on you have to basically here explain. The question wants your explanation of what has been John Rawls' contribution to the liberal theory of justice. Now, one important point you have to keep in mind, that this explanation means that you have to focus on all the 3 books of John Rawls. Obviously his masterpiece, A Theory of Justice, second, Political Liberalism, and third, The Law of Peoples. Keep that in mind. So what was, okay, so contribution of John Rawls in his first book, A Theory of Justice, which he wrote in 1971, Political Liberalism, which he wrote in 1993, and The Law of People, which he wrote in 1999. So what all ideas related to justice which he had introduced in these 3 books you have to emphasize. Keep in mind, if you are focusing only on the first book of John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, your answer will be incomplete. So to understand John Rawls' contribution to the liberal idea of justice in totality, you have to focus on what all ideas he gave in his 3 books. Okay. The first book, and at the same time you have to write using the keywords. These keywords of his theory of justice, which highlight the novelty in his theory of justice. The keywords: first, John Rawls said justice is the first virtue of society, as truth is to the system of thought. He conceptualized justice as, now it is said, he used a form of social contract theory to reconcile individual liberalism with the principle of redistributive and social justice. This in essence captures his contribution. How reconcile individual liberalism with the principles of redistribution and social justice. And remember, John Rawls said justice as fairness, which is fair to all sections of society. John Rawls, basically, his theory of justice is pure procedural theory of justice, which under controlled conditions, he said, will take care of the distributive justice. And how he talked about the 2 principles of justice. These 2 principles of justice are based on reflective equilibrium. Keep in mind, I am using the keyword. The reflective equilibrium was used by John Rawls. I hope you are able to recollect what is reflective equilibrium. And pure procedural theory of justice and 2 principles. The 2 principles of justice. The first was equal liberty principle, and the second, social economic inequalities to be arranged in such a way that they lead to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. He talked about priority rule, where 1 is greater than 2b greater than 2a, if you remember. This he talked about the lexical priority. He said his theory of justice is deontological, unlike utilitarianism. Remember, utilitarian theory, it gave priority to good over right. Teleological theory gave priority to right over good. John Rawls said he was inspired by Kant's philosophy, where he said every individual possesses possesses dignity, and this dignity cannot be violated for the purpose of even welfare of the society as a whole. John Rawls was inspired by Kant when he said individuals' capacities are productive capacities are social assets, and this is justified on this he said is what will be the difference principle. Difference principle. John Rawls said economic inequality will be justified in society only if it leads to the greatest benefit to the least advantaged section. And John Rawls gave the concept of if I say, he gave the concept of democratic equality, and as well as he had emphasized on the chain connection, where John Rawls supported chain connection. John Rawls supported a substantially redistributive welfare state. This democratic equality, it ensures that the meritorious are given the incentives, but at the same time ensuring that whatever incentives is given to them, it ultimately results in benefit to the poor. So first book he talked about. So while writing what was John Rawls' contribution as far as first book is concerned, keep in mind I am focusing on the keywords. As far as his second book is concerned, okay, now as I have already discussed, inequality, he emphasized on chain connection. Economic inequality is justifiable. It leads to the greatest benefit to the poorest section in society. This is about the first book. The second book, now John Rawls' contribution to liberal theory of justice was not only that he supported a welfare state by his difference principle, by his need of giving incentive to the meritorious, but at the same time, John Rawls' theory of justice, it led to revival of the normative political theory, and how subsequent political philosophers, they built on the normative tradition built by John Rawls' theory of justice. Okay, so communitarianism, for example, when it criticized John Rawls' theory of justice, in response to communitarian critique, communitarian side said that what is justice? It depended upon that community's notion of justice. There cannot be any universal principle of justice. So in that context, John Rawls, in his second book, Political Liberalism, he reduced it to liberal political conception of justice. It is not a universal, it is liberal political conception of justice, where he gave the notion of overlapping consensus. He accepted that citizens who are guided by their different comprehensive moral or philosophical doctrines in their private sphere, they continue to be guided by that, but in the public sphere, they will agree to the common set of principles which each person will justify it from the vantage point of his or her own moral philosophical doctrines. And this is because they believed in a reasonable pluralism. So John Rawls revised his theory of justice, and by saying that it is applicable to the liberal society, not applicable universally, it is applicable to the political sphere. That is why it was called as liberal political conception of justice. These two key terms in particular shall definitely come. And then the law of the peoples, how he, in response to the cosmopolitan critics like Thomas Pogge, Charles Beats, when they asked about the applicability of difference principle at the global level, John Rawls said that no, difference principle is having limited applicability. That limited applicability, when he said limited applicability, simply means that the rich countries basically will help the poor countries only to a certain level. Why? Because he believed wealth creation is a result of lot of factors like character of the people, the political culture, etc. And he also gave the idea of 8 principles and 3 institutions, which liberal people and non-liberal decent people will agree. If I am able to recall, 8 principles and 3 institutions. So this is with respect to his views on global justice. So the question is about how he enriched the idea of liberal, the idea of justice. So first book, second book and third book explain how he did so. And then you have to emphasize on assessment. As I said, assessment means obviously he revived the normative political theory, and subsequent political theorists, they considered Rawls as the reference point. Whether it is Nozick, whether it is capability approach of Amartya Sen, or whether it is even feminist perspective. So how John Rawls' theory of justice has triggered a debate among different viewpoints, and how all these debates used John Rawls as a reference point. In fact, Robert Nozick, he accepted greatness of John Rawls, that he was a reference point for subsequent theorists. So this is how John Rawls basically enriched the liberal idea of justice. And keep this fact in mind, as I've been emphasizing in class, that John Rawls has over the years become a favorite topic of UPSC. So look at the question paper. You find there's a continuous one question has definitely been asked from John Rawls, and this is what I've been telling you, that if you understand John Rawls' concept of justice thoroughly, you are securing at least 20 marks. And this has come. So John Rawls' theory of justice was expected. Okay. Now the context also becomes important. In which context it was asked? No, in the times of pandemic, you know about the vaccine nationalism. Vaccine nationalism. This vaccine nationalism is linked to his idea of global justice. How the rich countries, they have been hoarding all the vaccines and said we will ensure vaccines to the people of other countries only when we have inoculated all our populations. This talks about the difference principle, limited applicability. Okay, so in that context, so I interpret it in that way, that how this question has been asked. Coming to the next question. Now next question we find, basically next question talks about, now examine the importance. It talks about examine the importance of behavioral approach and what led to its decline. And here, you know, when you examine, basically you point to both. Examine means looking at things closely. So you have to examine the importance of behavioral approach. Keywords: examine, importance, behavioral approach, and what led to its decline. And see, the question has two parts. So your answer shall include both these parts. So examine, starting with examine, basically means you have to give a detailed evaluation of the concepts, basically talking about importance, highlighting both what has been the benefits, what has been the drawback, and then moving on to the second part, what led to its decline. Okay. Now here, since this is a 15 marks question, remember it is a 15 marks question. Word limit is around 200 to 225 to 50 words. You have to be very economical in answering this question. And so, you know, if I talk about the introduction, basically, introduction shall be about behavioralism and straight away focusing on its importance. Okay. Now, if you see what shall be the main body and conclusion of this now, introduction. Okay, in introduction, I have started basically with Robert Dahl. He says, behavioralism is a protest movement within political science. Why this was a protest movement? Because it was critical of the traditional approaches which had not improved on their technology, and that's how it contributed to the decline of basically political theory. So it's a protest movement within political science. It was meant to address the decline of the discipline. The context was of its emergence was decline. Decline is specifically, you know how the political scientists were not at all consulted by the policy makers, and as compared to advances in other disciplines, political science lagged behind. And how this behavioral movement, behavioralism, it emerged in the writings of David Easton. He is often called as the high priest of behavioralism, and it was seen in the works of scholars like Almond, Carl Dosch, David Apter, Harold Laswell, etc. So basically you have to, in the introduction itself, you have given the context. In the introduction itself, you have given the context of emergence of behavioralism. Why, in which context is emerged, why it emerged. Okay. And keep in mind, the question asks you importance of behavioral approach and its decline, reasons for its decline. So the question is importance of behavioral approach and reason of its decline. You do not have to explain what is behavioral approach. Hitting the nail on its head, time and again I am emphasizing you. Time is limited, word limit is limited, space is limited. So you do not have to explain what is behavioralism. Straight away you can write that in which context it rose and how behavioral revolution, it was often called as the methodological revolution. Methodological revolution. It emphasized on scientific study of the politics. So all this, the context and its basically meaning, its small features, you can straight away write in the introduction, one paragraph, and then straight away go for its importance. What is importance of behavioralism? Now, importance of behavioralism can be seen, the most important influence of behavioralism, the most important point as far as the significance of behavioral movement is concerned. Now I have highlighted these points. First, it revived the political theory. It saved it from its decline. How it revived the political theory? By overcoming the weakness of the traditional approaches. It resurrected political theory. Most important contribution. Second, it made individual the center of attention instead of institutions, formal institutions. Now, center of attraction, the very name behavioralism, it wanted to study the behavior of the individuals as political actors. So it shifted attention from the structure of the states, formal structure of the state, to shift in the behavior of the individuals. How individuals behave in actual political situation, how they behave as a voter, how they behave as a power holder, how they behave as a power seeker. Basically, behavior of individuals. It focused on that. It led to refinement of the tools and techniques of research. Basically, it emphasized on interdisciplinary research. Interdisciplinary research. If you remember the 8 tenets of behavioralism given by David Easton, interdisciplinary research basically means by using advances in various other disciplines, sociology, anthropology, psychology, it incorporated the concepts in political science, and how it led to refinement of the methods and techniques. So it led to the refinement of the tools and techniques of research, which helped to analyze political phenomena, to understand its various other dimensions. And this methodology tools, we can see observation, interviews, survey research, case studies, data collection, statistical analysis. All these new techniques, it were the contribution of behavioralism, and how they were meant to refine the tools and techniques of research. How it threw light on the important matters, if I say. It threw light on important matters like quality of political participation, problems of leadership, voting patterns, and role of political parties and pressure groups. So it took into account not only formal institutions but also non-formal institutions. What is the impact on the politics? So it broadened the study of the subject matter of political science, where they studied quality of political participation, leadership, voting patterns, role of political parties and pressure groups. And this way it is said that behavioralism, this way it is said, as a result it contributed to rich scientific and analytical data on individual and group behavior. Remember, the very name behavioralism focuses on behavior. So by various methods and techniques of research, by its focus on studying the non-formal aspect of the politics, it yielded a rich data in form of rich and scientific data on individual and group behavior. And obviously one of the important contribution of behavioralism is in the field of comparative politics. You know comparative politics, how earlier comparative politics was known as comparative government, later on became comparative government and politics. So it broadened the scope of comparative government and politics. How? It made the study of the politics in the third world countries, which differs significantly from the politics in the first world. So comparative analysis was possible because of behavioralism, the new methods, techniques, approaches which behavioralism established. And Peter Merkel said, the conflict and challenge to accept the new ideas brought about the waves of innovation and led to the great benefit in the development of the discipline. Behavioralism, and which emphasized on the modern approaches to study politics, it existed with the traditional approaches like legal institutional approach, philosophical approach, historical approach. Okay. So it presented a new challenge, and how the debate among the traditionalist and behavioralist. Remember, behavioralism was led by American political scientists. So how this debate has led to waves of innovation, and it has contributed to the great benefit to the discipline's development. So this is about importance of behavioralism. Okay. And here we find that obviously behavioralism suffered from its decline. The decline were partly because of weaknesses of behavioralism. And weaknesses of behavioralism, if I say reason it led to decline. Now here Strauss said the rise of behavioralism was symptomatic of crisis in political theory. This was because behavioralism, in its quest, in its search for a value-free analysis of political phenomena, it ignored normative issues. So behavioralism, which had arrested the first decline of political theory, certain features of behavioralism contributed to the second decline of political theory. These are the weaknesses of behavioralism. So how Strauss said that it ignored the normative issues, and because of ignorance of normative issues like liberty, equality, justice, rights, it was unable to solve the problems of social unrest in United States. The decade of 1960s was a troublesome decade for US society. There's social unrest, civil rights movement, students protest, the protest against disarmament, anti-Vietnam War protest. Behavioralism had no answer to solve these problems, which contributed to second decline. In fact, the high priest of behavioralism, David Easton, he himself accepted that the behavioralists were sitting in their ivory towers. It means completely cut off from the reality. So they were sitting in ivory towers, they forgot the purpose of the discipline. And David Easton himself accepted the problems of behavioralism when he said, it ignored what is the duty of intellectuals. The duty of intellectuals, he said, is to protect the humane values of civilization. So knowledge is important, but for what sake that knowledge is used, that was forgotten by the behavioralism. They were obsessed with refinement of the techniques. So they were obsessed, excessive focus on pure science. Their excessive focus on refinement of techniques, for that they compromised with the scope of the discipline. They ignored the normative issues because of the emphasis on value-free analysis. And due to these reasons, behavioralism suffered from decline. And but even though it led to the second decline of political theory, but you have to, conclusion, you have to discuss a bit about post-behavioralism. Now post-behavioralism emerged to overcome the weaknesses of behavioralism that you can give in conclusion. It did not reject behavioralism per se. It reintroduced the concern with values in behavioralism. So knowledge is important, but what is the utility of that knowledge? The utility of that knowledge is to solve the problems of society. So scientific study is important. Yes, all the methodologies, approaches, techniques given by behavioralism is important. But emphasis is on what use it is for the solving the problems of society. That is what you have to focus. So here it talked about relevance and action, problem solving, renewed concern with values, and what the credo of relevance. This term was given by David Easton. So in conclusion, you can write about how post-behavioralism emerged to save the discipline from decline. In fact, it built on the ideas of behavioralism, and one thing which introduced was its concern with values. This is what you have to emphasize. So this way, that is what you have to conclude as far as behavioralism is concerned. Okay. Now, if you move on to the next question, we find this is question 2C. Now, question 2C talks about, can there be universal conception of human rights? Can there be universal conception of human rights? Give your arguments. So, examiner asks you, give your arguments. So here you have, now in give your arguments question, you have to provide a detailed analysis. And obviously, in conclusion, you have to give a way out. Which of the view seems to be more plausible? Okay. Now, can there be a universal conception of human rights? Okay. Now, here, if I have to discuss what shall be the structure of the answer. Okay. What shall be the structure of the answer? Now, in structure of the answer, you have to first focus on the as I say, introduction, main body, and conclusion. Now, in introduction, as far as this question is concerned, you have to define human rights. You have to define human rights. You have to briefly light in one line the context of its emergence, and you have to discuss about the various the three generations of human rights. The three generations of human rights. Okay, and you have to discuss about the various declaration and conventions. Declaration and conventions. Declaration and conventions. Okay, which were the source of human rights. Human rights definition. Okay, now human rights definition, if you see, that was already given in the material which was given to you people. Now, if we talk about definition of human rights, now human rights are those rights which are available to individuals by virtue of them being human beings. Okay, and these are international moral and legal norms. They are designed to protect people. The international moral and legal norms that aspire to protect everywhere individual. Human rights are modern and secular version of natural rights. And human rights, if you see the features of human rights, the features of human rights, if you see, human rights are absolute, human rights are universal in the sense that they belong to human beings everywhere. They, by virtue of human beings, every person is entitled to human rights. When he has exhausted all his rights, what is left with him is human rights. That cannot be taken away because by virtue of him being human. So they are fundamental, they are indivisible, they are absolute, and they constitute the very source of all rights of human beings. This is definition of human rights. The context was obviously the context of its emergence was obviously what happened in the Second World War, Holocaust, the systematic extermination of Jews by the Nazi regime. Okay, and if you see human rights, basically, if you talk about the three generations of human rights, obviously You have to emphasize on how you have to Karel Vesak, basically Karel Vesak, he gave the 3 generation of human rights, and these 3 generation of human rights, you find that these tables of human rights, if you see 3 generation of human rights, the first generation were in 18th and 19th century. The first generation deals with civil and political rights, and the key theme was liberty, and UN declarations were there. The second generation emphasized on social and economic rights. The key theme was equality and how, which UN documents they support. The third generation, they are called as solidarity rights, fraternity. And if you see, Jack Donnelly in fact says that liberty, equality and fraternity, are they not the key slogans of French Revolution? Yes. So all these first, second and third generation of human rights, basically they emphasized on the rights which are available to human beings as individuals, rights which are available to human beings as groups also. And the third generation of human rights, they talk about self-determination, peace, development and environmental protection, which has been emphasized by Stockholm Convention of the Human Environment, etc. So in the introduction part, you have to discuss here. Now, as far as presentation also matters. Okay. So while discussing 3 generations of human rights, you can simply draw the chart that will save your time as well as improve your presentation. The table which I showed you. Okay. Now, as far as the declaration and conventions is concerned, obviously there are International Bill of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of 1948, along with the 2 covenants on civil and political rights and social, economic and cultural rights, and various other international documents. Okay, so this is about introduction where to talk about the human rights. Now, the question talks about, are human rights universal? And here you have to refer to the debates. Now, are human rights universal? And here you have to refer to the debate. In debate, okay. Now in debate, yes, the supporters of human rights, for example, liberal scholars, they have been emphasizing on universal nature of human rights. Now liberal scholars, starting with John Locke, okay. Now they said that, for example, when John Locke talked about the system of natural rights, okay, he talked about life, liberty and property, okay. And as liberal scholars, as it has developed over a period of time, liberal scholars emphasize on universality, where individuals are seen as right bearers. So supporters have emphasized on universal nature of human rights. The very definition of human rights say that these are available to individuals by virtue of being human. That is why these rights are inalienable, indivisible, we have discussed. Okay. But this is questioned by cultural relativist perspective. Cultural relativists perspective. This is questioned by communitarian perspective. And this is questioned by feminist also. So in the debate, you have to give their views also. Cultural relativists have been emphasizing that what are rights, it is defined by the culture. There are no universal definition of human rights. They say that universal definition, the universal human rights are basically, they emphasize the liberal values and principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they emphasize the liberal values and principles, and how they pinpoint that the they tend to create and sustain the institutions of liberal democracy. So cultural relativists have been emphasizing what is human right rather than being universal human rights, which are basically based on liberal notions, Western notions. What is right? It is cultural specific. And here you have to mention the Asian values debate. Now the Asian values debate is a prime example of the cultural relativist perspective given by Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir Mohamad. They say, and if you see, the liberal perspective of human rights is challenged by proponents of Asian values debate. So they question, they say that no, what is rights has to be culture specific. They emphasize against universalism, they emphasize on particularism, that what rights are, it is to be defined by the, what rights are, basically it is to be defined by the Asian, the context of the Asian values. And if you see the materials which were given to you, that was clearly mentioned in the materials which was circulated to you. Okay. Now here we find, these are meta international conventions. Now here you find the cultural relativist perspective. Okay. And cultural relativist perspective on rights, basically it emphasized that each culture has its own notion of human rights and freedoms, and human rights can only exist by reverting back to the cultural norms and not looking to the Western legal documents. And here the Asian values debate, the proponents of the Asian values debate, they emphasize on basically the three themes. They emphasize on three themes. First is universal versus relativism, individualism versus communitarianism, and civil political rights versus economic issues. Now here the Asian values debate ideology is a main example of cultural relativism. It was given by Mahathir Mohamad and Lee Kuan Yew. And here they say that human rights is an alien imposition from the West, and they emphasize the existence of the rival Asian values like social harmony, respect for authority, and a belief in the family. They say that in Asia it is a community which has been emphasized. In Asia it is a respect for authority which has been emphasized, and they question that the poor countries of the third world, they cannot afford the luxury of human rights. For them what is important is socio-economic development, and for that we need to place priority to the authoritarian regimes. Okay, so the question, the Asian values debate in particular, they question the notion of universal human rights, and they say, now universal human rights, they say they prioritize individuals, and Lee Kuan Yew had said Asia has never valued individual over society. The society has always been more important than the individual. And Asian values debate, they emphasize on economic and social rights, and they say to ensure that to the people we need authoritarian regimes, and hence political and civil rights are not that important. They give priority to that. So here, while discussing the cultural relativist perspective, you have to discuss about the Asian values debate. That how Asian values debate, it questions the notion of universal human rights, and they say that it has to be cultural specific. What rights are, it depends upon the culture. As far as communitarians' views concerned, here you have to emphasize on the views of Michael Walzer. Michael Walzer also emphasizes on the notion that what right is, it depends on the community's notion of what is right and wrong. Communitarians basically say an individual is embedded in his community, and his identity, his values, beliefs, preferences, everything is shared by community's context. So there shall not be any universal notion of rights, human rights. Basically what will be right, it will be dependent upon that community's context and the social meaning of the goods, and that's how they object to universality of human rights. The feminist, for example, Iris Marion Young, She emphasizes on the concept of differentiated citizenship. That instead of universal set of rights and justice, what is needed is the group specific rights, keeping in mind the group's culture, history, needs, aspirations, etc. The feminists say that universality of human rights, basically they privilege the male concerns. So this context of universality is opposed by cultural relativists, communitarians and feminists. It is what you have to write about the debate. Now coming to the conclusion part, and in conclusion you have to discuss the arguments which emphasize on Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For example, they say that these rights are available to human beings. These rights are available to human beings by virtue of their common humanity. So common humanity, it is more fundamental than the culture. They say that cultural relativist perspective, or for that matter the group perspective, the differentiated citizenship given by Young, or the communitarian perspective given by Walzer, they justify certain inhuman practices which violate individual dignity, like female genital mutilation. It is considered as a correct in many parts of Africa. So many inhuman practices which violate self-dignity, which violate respect of the individual, can be justified in the name of cultural specific rights. In fact, they say that the human rights concept of human rights is new to all the cultures, and they say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted in the year 1948, it was drafted by people from different cultures, and it was not only Western cultures. They emphasize that, for example, Michael Ignatieff, he says that the opposition to human rights is basically done by the vested interest, whose position depends on violation of human rights of the certain sections of the people. And another argument is given that human rights are basically the dynamic concepts. Human rights are basically the dynamic concepts. The dynamic concept, first, second, third. Now there is a debate among scholars about the fourth generation of human rights. So human rights is a dynamic concept, and with changing time, changing social consciousness, the notion of the rights also changes. Now there is a debate about fourth generation of human rights. The fourth generation of human rights, basically, for example, they emphasize that how technological development may encroach human rights of the entire humanity. They go beyond individual human rights, they go beyond the group rights or cultural rights, and they say the modern technological development, it is going to it is going to encroach the modern technological development, it is going to encroach the rights of the common humanity. And they give two specific examples. The first example is when they talk the genetic engineering, and, for example, exploration of space. So genetic engineering and exploration of space. Genetic engineering, designer babies. A Chinese scientist had claimed that it successfully brought about the genetic engineering in the fetus to produce designer babies. So they say this technological development may exploit the rights common to humanity, and that's how there is a debate of the fourth generation of human rights. So basically human rights, it is said, despite objection by the cultural relativist perspective and other perspectives, it is to be understood that human rights belong to the entire humanity by virtue of them being human. And wherever the human beings will be there, irrespective of their nationality, religion, culture, creed, human rights will be a standard of rights which will come to aid of the people. Okay, so that is what you have to emphasize on the concept of this question, that which it asks you for your arguments. So given for and against, as well as the most plausible way out, that what should be the conclusion. Okay, this is about human rights. Moving on to the next question. Now next question, it talks about now again this question has two parts, keep that in mind. Whenever the question is having two parts, you have to emphasize on the both the parts of the question. Now this question says, explain the Aristotelian view of politics. To what extent do you think it has contributed to the development of modern day constitutional democracies? So explain the Aristotelian view of politics. First part, to what extent it has contributed to the development of modern day constitutional democracies. The keyword here is explain Aristotelian view of politics and how it has contributed to the development, to what extent it has contributed to the development of constitutional democracies. Two parts. Now the word used is explain. You have to just as far as explanation is concerned. Now in explanation part you have to basically give a detailed description of the Aristotle's view of politics. Okay, so it will have introduction, main body and conclusion. Now what will be the structure of this answer? Let us see. Now structure of this answer. Okay, Aristotle's view of politics. Now what is the respective weightage? The respective weightage of these two parts of the question. I will say broadly it will be around 70-30 or 80-20, whatever you can say. Okay, so main focus should be on giving Aristotle's view of politics. Now what as far as introduction is concerned is main body and conclusion. Now as far as introduction is concerned, now in introduction, if you find you can simply start with Aristotle is called as father of political science. Aristotle is called as father of political science. He is called as father of political science because he defined the subject matter of politics. He defined the subject matter of politics, and where he had talked about sovereignty of the law, he talked about constitutionalism, he had talked about the proportionate rewards, he had talked about the remedies of the revolution, etc. And here Andrew Hacker said Aristotle is called as the first political scientist. Aristotle is called as the first political scientist. He is called as first political scientist, it is said, because Aristotle in a way he had given a conception of science of politics, the science of politics which studied which is based on the observation. It is based on observation and classification of political institutions and behavior. So Aristotle is called as the first political scientist because his notion of science of politics, is based on observation. It is based on observation and classification. It is based on observation and classification of political institutions and behavior. Remember, Aristotle in his book Politics, he had studied the then prevailing 158 constitutions of the world of his time, and that how he had given his classification of constitutions. So Aristotle is called as father of political science. In his book Politics, he had given 158 classification of constitutions. He was the first to systematically classify them, and Andrew Hacker says he is the first political scientist because of he talked about science of politics, observation, classification, political institutions and behavior. This is introductory part. Moving on to the main body. The main body will have two parts. The first part is obviously what was Aristotle's view of politics. Now, as far as Aristotle's view of politics is concerned, now you have to emphasize on the various main features of his politics. And here again the keywords will be coming which Aristotle has used. The first point, if I say, you have to explain about why Aristotle called politics as the master science. Why Aristotle called politics as the master science? He called politics as the master science, you know, because politics, it studied human beings in a political society and how they can lead a meaningful life only as a member of the state. Remember, Aristotle had said, a man who lives outside the state can be either a god or either as a beast. Okay, the politics decide the ordering of the sciences to be studied by the citizens. So why he said politics as a master science, you have to explain. Second, you have to explain his the organic theory of state, organic view of state, where he said the state is teleologically prior to man, not chronologically. The state is teleologically prior to man. He said man is zoon politikon. He had considered man as zoon politikon. The state is teleologically prior to man, not chronologically. The state exists. He considered that the state is an instrument of perfection. The state is an instrument of perfection of individuals. The state is meant to secure good life of the individual, and individual realizes his telos, eudaimonia. Individual realizes his telos, eudaimonia by participation in the affairs of the state. Okay, so you have to explain about the organic view of state given by Aristotle, emphasizing these points. Aristotle was a realist and pragmatic thinker. He was a realist and pragmatic thinker. Unlike his master Plato, who was an idealist, Aristotle believed in pragmatism. His principle of golden mean, on his principle of golden mean, he avoided extremes. In fact, it is said that conservation and moderation were the guiding principles of his political philosophy. So he was a realist, pragmatic and conservative thinker. He was not radical like Plato. Remember, he believed in improving the existing institutions rather than creating an altogether new institutions. So he was conservative, realist and pragmatic thinker. In fact, his philosophy was guided by realism and gradualism. His philosophy was guided by realism and gradualism. Remember, he had said, he had criticized Plato's philosopher king, and he had said, it is better for the king to be worldly wise than wise in the world of ideas. Aristotle, on the ground of practicality, he had said that Plato's scheme of communism of wives and property is impractical. It will lead to instability in the state. How family is a natural institution. Okay, and Aristotle is said to have separated. Aristotle is said to have distinguished. Aristotle is said to have distinguished political from non-political. distinguished political from non-political. On that ground, for example, he had said, the role of a statesman is different from role of the head of the family. Okay, so he was the first person who distinguished politics from the non-political, and that is why, you know, it is said to be a precursor. It is said to be a precursor of the modern innovation of civil society. And that's how this distinction between public and private divide was made a cornerstone of liberalism. I'm saying this distinction between public and private divide was made a cornerstone of liberalism by John Locke. Okay, this was given by Aristotle. Now if you see Aristotle, he talked about this Aristotelian view of politics. He was the first person to pay attention, it is said, pay attention to economic basis of political institutions. Economic basis of political institutions. And where he talked about his principle of golden mean, talked about avoiding extremes of wealth. He had talked about that how when there is extremes of wealth, it leads to revolution. And that is exactly what happened, suppose say in one of the modern revolution, French Revolution. One of the reasons for its revolution was the gross inequality. So this principle of golden mean, as I said, it avoided extremes, and that he saw the first person to pay attention to economic basis of political institutions. Remember his statement, he had said, inequality everywhere is a cause of revolution, he had said. Now in his classification of constitutions, Aristotle talked about the best practicable state. Aristotle talked about the best practicable state. Now in the best practicable state which Aristotle talked about was his polity. His best practicable state was polity. Now best practicable state, he was not bothered with ideal state. His ideal state was basically aristocracy. But on ground of feasibility, remember he was a realist and pragmatic thinker. On ground of feasibility, Aristotle basically singled out polity as the best practicable state. This polity is a rule of the middle class which combines the forces of quality and quantity. And here Aristotle talked about which combine forces of quality and quantity. And here Aristotle talked about this polity is another name for constitutional government. This polity is another name for constitutional government. It is characterized by rule of law. Characterized by rule of law. Now Aristotle's rule of law. Remember Aristotle had criticized philosopher king on that ground also. That law is a reason without passion. Law is a reason without passion. And Aristotle had said that the law has additional safeguards which is not available in the rule of even the most wise person. Aristotle had believed that this customary law is better than the knowledge of the wisest ruler. And this Aristotle's position of the rule of law was accepted by Plato in his subsequent work, The Laws. And it is one of the reasons why it is said Aristotle's best state is Plato's second best state. Okay, so best practicable is polity. It is guided by rule of law, and in rule of law there is no arbitrary power. There is a check on arbitrary power, which was not the case with Plato's philosopher king. Here there is a periodic rotation of the offices. It ensures nobody has a monopoly of power. The periodic rotation of offices. There is a periodic rotation of offices when nobody has the monopoly of power. Remember, Lord Acton famously said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there need to be a check on the authority of the ruler, and that is how he later on believed, Plato also believed that the ruler is, ruler is its guardian. Ruler is the guardian of the law, and ruler is also the servant of the law. So constitutionalism, in his time Aristotle had said that constitution basically has three offices: deliberative, magisterial and judicial offices, and citizens will take turn to rule and be ruled in turn. Okay. Now here Aristotle, in his classification, he had talked about democracy. He talked about democracy as a perverted form of government. But as Sabine says, Aristotle believed in that the collective wisdom of the people, is greater than the wisdom of the most wise person. So unlike his master Plato, he was willing to accept the good features of democracy. His conception of citizenship, you will find, is exclusionary. His conception of citizenship is exclusionary because it excluded women, it excluded old people, it excluded children, it excluded laborers, it excluded resident aliens. He did not believe women have the capacity to deliberate. But those who were entitled to take part in citizenship rights, keep that point, those who were entitled to take part in citizenship rights, basically there was equality amongst them, and any decision has to be taken on the basis of consensus. Why the deliberation? So despite exclusionary, he promoted the notion of active citizenship, where participation in the affairs of the state was considered as the highest virtue, and that's how through participation the individual was able to realize his eudaimonia. Okay. So this way we have to understand that this is Aristotle's view of politics. Okay, and Aristotle also talked about the relation between politics and ethics, where he says, in an ideal state, a good citizen, a good person is a good citizen. So politics and ethics are related. Okay, so this is about Aristotle's views on democracy, Aristotle's views on revolution. And in revolution he did talk about the image of the government that I have already discussed is important. Image of the government is important, and it is important to cultivate respect for law even in small matters. Now if we see Aristotle's view of politics, it automatically gives us the answer to the second part of the question. And if you see the second part of the question, talks about to what extent. Now the second part of the question talks about to what extent do you think, the second part of the question talks about to what extent do you think it has contributed to development of modern day constitutional democracies? Now here you have to analyze it, you give analysis. So his contribution to modern day constitutional democracies, the word used is constitutional and the word used is democracies. Constitutional democracies. Constitutionalism means limited government, democracy means power of the people, what Abraham Lincoln said, of the government of the people, by the people and for the people. And here you have to highlight this point, that obviously his constitutionalism, he talked about constitutionalism, where government is having no arbitrary power, government is having limited power. Here you have to emphasize on the fact of how he distinguished political from the non-political, that how the government's authority is limited only to the public sphere and not to the private sphere. He talked about citizenship rights. Even though his citizenship right was exclusionary, you have to emphasize that it was based on equality among citizens and consensus. Okay. So one drawback of his concept of citizenship was no universal debt franchise, it did not believe in equal moral worth of the individuals. What Kant had said, nobody can be made a means for somebody's end. Aristotle had justified slavery. Despite that weakness, you have to emphasize that he had given the notion of active citizenship, that participation was considered as the highest duty. So this way, Aristotle, he also talked about the collective wisdom, that though democracy even being perverted form of government, even being based on the false notion of equality, it is based on happy versatility, even though democracy has its advantage. And he, in his polity, he talked about middle class as the anchor of stability. This is true for democracies even today. He talked about how to ensure stable democracies, that stable democracies has to be ensured by minimizing the inequalities of income, recognizing merit and proportionate equality. That is also vital. That is also vital for ensuring the stability of the state. Okay. So this way Aristotle contributed to the development of the constitutional democracies, despite his theory of citizenship being exclusionary, despite he supported inequality, natural hierarchy like his master Plato. So on that basis, in conclusion, you have to write that how his views subsequently influenced later thinkers like Machiavelli. Machiavelli also had preferred mixed constitution. Machiavelli also emphasized republicanism, and how Aristotle had in a way significantly contributed to this constitutional democracies. Now moving on to the next question, we find the next question was a very straight question, if I say, and this question was quite expected. The context of asking this question, if you see, regarding Sayyid Ahmad Khan, was the 100th year of the Aligarh Muslim University, the institution which he had founded. Okay, so it was expected, we were expecting a question, and that's what it came. Now if you see a statement is given, and on basis of that statement you have to give the answer. It talks about when a nation becomes devoid of arts and learning, it invites poverty. In light of this statement, assess the role of Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a reformer. So the key words, basically arts and learning and assess reformer. So this question basically talks about role of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a reformer. Okay, and here if we talk about structure of this question, is pretty simple question. Okay, now if you see the structure of this question, if we talk about the structure of this question about Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a modernizer, Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a modernizer. Now Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a modernizer, okay, you have to keep the fact in mind that in introduction, main body and conclusion. Remember the word here is assess. Now introduction, it is said Sayyid Ahmad Khan was one of the major figures of the 19th century, and he contributed immensely to carrying out reform especially with related to Muslims in the modern India. Okay, so a simple statement, straight away you are hitting on the nail when you are emphasizing on his role as a modernizer. When you emphasize on the role of Sayyid Ahmad Khan as a modernizer, and keep that in mind, that the question talks about as his role as a reformer. Okay, now as a reformer, you can straight away start with emphasizing on the role of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, that he was the founder of the Aligarh movement. He was a founder of the Aligarh movement, and Aligarh movement had two broad goals. First was the reform of Islam, and second was promoting modern education. Promoting modern education. Now, both these goals were interrelated. Now, in reform of Islam, basically he wanted to also impress the Britishers that Islam is a modern progressive religion. Islam is not antithetical to the Western practices, and that's how he wanted to change the British attitude towards the Muslims, which had become very adversarial after revolt of 1858. At the same time, he also wanted to impress upon the common Muslims that you have to adopt a scientific and rational attitude to analyze, to appreciate the scientific aspects of Islam, and this way their attitude towards the Britishers will also change. So that was an interrelation between reform of Islam and the promoting modern education. So reform of Islam, he established a magazine called he had established a magazine, Tahzibul Akhlaq, which emphasized on getting rid of the obscurantist practices in the Islam. To promote modern education, he in fact he was very much impressed by the British institutions, educational institutions which he had visited when he was on his trip to England, and he wanted to create a center of higher learning for the Muslims in India. So that way he established a scientific society. He established a scientific society to translate the modern scientific and philosophical works into Urdu. He also established the Aligarh Muslim Mohammedan and Mao College, basically Mao College, Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. And this Mao College, Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, this Mao College became the nucleus of the Aligarh Muslim University. He was very much clear that Muslim community has to get itself educated to gain advantage, to gain progress, because Hindus were earlier to adopt the modern education. So this way he was concerned about the plight of the Muslims, and for his progressive views about reform of Islam, promoting Western education, he was attacked by the conservatives, and he was unfazed by criticism, and he continued his reformist activity. And Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, basically the doors of his Mao College were open to all communities. Many of its first graduates and teachers were from Hindu community. So this way Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan played a very important role, that he was a leading figure for reform, and he brought about modernization in Muslims community. And in conclusion, we can assess his role, that sometimes he is criticized that he is a leader of a community and not a nation. He is a leader of the community and not a nation, because he emphasized on protecting and promoting the interest of the Muslims. But many scholars say that obviously he was not communal in his outlook, where some trace his the origin of two-nation theory to him. Faizan Mustafa, scholars like Faizan Mustafa, they particularly reject the idea. And basically Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was broad in his outlook, and his contribution was very significant as far as the reform activities in Muslims is concerned. So that is what you have to emphasize on, role of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan as a modernizer. Now if we look to the next question. Now next question talks about question 3C. Political ideology is primarily concerned. Now see the question, it's a very important question. It talks about political ideology. If I have to identify the keywords, so political ideology is primarily concerned with allocation and utilization of power and the comment. So political ideology is primarily concerned with allocation and utilization of power, and the word is comment. Word used is comment. Okay, so as I have already explained, in comment you have to provide a detailed comprehensive analysis highlighting the prospects and the consequences, pros and cons basically of the issue. Now here what is the meaning of that statement? The meaning of the statement is political ideology is primarily concerned with allocation and utilization of power. Meaning of the statement simply says that political ideology is basically deals with how the power is allocated and utilized. Okay, so analyze the relationship between the keywords and then answer becomes clear. Now if I to emphasize on the structure of the answer. Now introduction, main body and conclusion. Now in introduction you have to basically emphasize on the power view of politics. The power view of politics, basically it was given by Machiavelli. Starting with Machiavelli, the power view of politics was given, and Machiavelli had emphasized that politics is a struggle for power. Power is the central concept of the study of politics. In fact, power holds the same position as money holds in the realm of economics. Okay, and here politics, which David Easton had also defined, politics is concerned with authoritative allocation of values. Authoritative allocation of values. Authoritative allocation of values. The moment authoritative comes, power automatically comes in. Authoritative is a legitimate power. Okay, so starting with definition of politics, politics is a struggle for power and politics is a authoritative allocation of values. Connect it with ideology. Connect it with basically the role of ideology. The moment you connect it with role of ideology, the relationship between political ideology and power becomes complete. That is what the question establishes the relation. So role of, if I say political ideology. Now political ideology, as we have discussed in the class, you will find political ideology is associated with particular classes. Political ideology is associated with particular class. It is always associated with political class, a particular class. For example, liberalism was supported by middle class, socialism was supported by the emerging working class, fascism was it's an extremism of the center, basically lower middle class, which Lipset had said. Feminism, obviously women are its main support base. So every ideology is associated with a particular class. If you see, ideology provide a perspective. Ideologies provide a perspective. These ideologies provide a perspective through which the world is understood and explained. They provide a perspective to influence political life. They provide a perspective to shape the nature of political system. Okay, and ideology, it also set goals. Ideology, it also set goals which inspire political action. Remember, Marx had said, workers of all world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Okay, so ideologies set goals that inspire political action. Ideologies, they provide a vision of a future society. They provide a vision of future society. They provide a vision of future society, of a good society. Okay, and that inspires political action. We've also discussed how ideology basically it upholds. Remember, ideology simply it supports the existing system or criticizes the existing system and gives an alternative. So in that context, how political ideology it upholds. If you say political ideology, it upholds the prevailing political ideology, it upholds the prevailing power structure. It upholds the prevailing power structure. How it considers, how it projects itself as fair, how it projects it as natural, how it projects the existing power structure as rightful. On the other hand, this political ideology also serves as a challenge to the existing power structure. Serves as a challenge to the existing power structure, where the opponents of that power structure, they highlight what is the weakness of that power structure, what is the unjustness, what is the inequality of that power structure, and they provide the alternate. They provide alternate power structure, They provide alternative power structure. That how, instead of existing order, the existing order is unjust, the existing order is based on inequity, and how it shall be removed and a better power structure will be created, and that inspires political action. So this way, you have to understand that question basically, what was the theme of the question? That political ideology is primarily concerned about allocation and utilization of power. Allocation means distribution, who gets what and how the power is utilized. So I have linked the David Easton's definition of politics as authoritative allocation of values along with power concept given by Machiavelli, and straightaway linked it with role of ideology. The moment you are clear with this link and the role of ideology, writing answer becomes clear. So in introduction, you have to write about politics, and here you have to discuss this role of ideology, and then go on to substantiate it with how different ideologies fulfill this role. And here you have to talk about the how different ideologies fulfill this role. Now here, just one word I would like to further emphasize. So this is the instrumental view of ideology. Instrumental view of ideology. That how ideology serves as an instrument to challenge, to legitimize or delegitimize an existing order. How ideology serves to give us basically an alternative goal for which people are ready to sacrifice. How it helps us to, it gives us a perspective to understand the existing order. This is whatever the role of ideology and how ideology is related to power structure. So before moving on to explaining how ideologies actually do it, you have to emphasize on the notion of politics and the notion of the ideology, where I have emphasized on the power view of politics. And here you have to substantiate this with the help of the classical ideologies and new ideologies. Classical ideologies and new ideologies. Classical ideologies like liberalism, like Marxism, like feminism, like nationalism, like fascism. Classical ideologies, okay. New ideologies, for example, feminism. New ideologies, for example, multiculturalism. And new ideologies like religious fundamentalism. Now, starting with, no, you can take, in your answer you can substantiate it. Religious fundamentalism. Taliban. Taliban's success in Afghanistan is guided by the religious fundamentalist ideology. It imposes Shariat law. It has imposed Shariat law on the people of Afghanistan. So in Taliban power structure, who is enjoying power? Those who support the radical view of Taliban. It's about allocation and utilization of power. If we talk about liberalism, liberalism basically was emphasized by the emerging middle class. Emerging middle class. It is emphasized by emerging middle class. And here liberalism emphasizes on the notion of state as a neutral arbiter. Notion of state as a neutral arbiter. It emphasized on that state's role is that of a night watchman. What classical liberals and new liberals support. State is a night watchman. They emphasized on laissez-faire individualism. Laissez-faire individualism. All basically how the emerging middle class was contesting the feudal privileges, how it was against absolute monarchy, and how it opposed the church, the whole of the church also. So it wanted to create an order where state is a neutral arbiter. It wanted to create an order where state is having constitutional government with checks and balances. It wanted to create an order where laissez-faire. Remember Adam Smith, state shall not interfere in the market. State shall not interfere in the market. The invisible hand of the market will take care of everything. Okay. And here how they say that formal equality only has to be understood in terms of formal equality. How they supported equality of status and opportunity. So it was basically an ideology of the emerging middle class which after consolidating its power, it started believing in status quo. This was challenged by ideology of socialism in particular. Marx said his socialism is scientific socialism. And how Marx said, basically, it is the economic factors which control everything in society. And how Marx talked about his, he had said state is not a neutral arbiter. How Marx said, state is an executive committee of the bourgeoisie. State is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. So he inspired the working class, bring about a revolution, spontaneous violent revolution, to bring about a new order. The new order is a communist society. This communist society will be a classless and stateless society, where free development of each is the condition of free development of all. This society will be free of exploitation, domination. In this society, there will not be surplus value to be appropriated by the capitalist. Marx also, in the interim period, Marx had also talked about the DOP, Dictatorship of Proletariat. So in dictatorship, who will have their power, it is the proletariat class which will be having the power. So political ideology talking about distribution, allocation and the utilization of power. The proletariat class will use the state power to smash the vestiges of the capitalism. Fascism, for example, fascism talked about, they talked about three classes of the people. They talked about three classes of people. The first is supreme leader, second is warrior elite, and third is the inert masses. Masses have no role other than to submit to the authority of the leader. They supported new man who is guided by loyalty, duty, sacrifice. So how unquestioned obedience to the dictate of the supreme leader. This supreme leader, he knows what is in the best interest of the masses. He represents the general will of the masses. Who enjoys power in fascism? It is the elite. Hitler was called as a Führer. The second rank will be the masses. So the warrior elite. And third will be masses. Remember, Mussolini said everything for the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state. So individuals have no right against the state. Ideology. It talks about distribution of power. And fascism, what was the class base of fascism? The lower middle class. Feminism. Now feminism talks about that women are disadvantaged and this disadvantage can and should be removed. Liberal feminism, they say that women should have equal rights at par with men in the political sphere, public sphere. Feminists have said patriarchy is a deep and institutionalized system of power. Radical feminists say it originates in the family, and this patriarchy where male dominate the female, it originates in the family and it is replicated at the wider societal level. That is why they highlight the slogan, personal is political. That power also operates within the family. It does not stop at the door of the family. And how radical feminists have been emphasizing on the equality in the family sphere. The Marxist feminists in particular, they say that emancipation of women will come as it will be a byproduct of the communist revolution. Okay, so feminism is also talked about power. It's use a feminist lens, and if I use the international relations, Cynthia in law says, where are women? So women are missing from the structures of the power. So this is how you have to emphasize on the classical ideologies as well as the new ideologies. How both classical and new ideologies, they talk about the allocation and utilization of the power. And then in conclusion, you can simply, a very smart way of concluding is, since you have already substantiated your view, thus we see that political ideology is the point. Now, one important point I forget here in Marxism. Now here, you also can invoke the view of Gramsci's hegemony. How the hegemony is ideological domination by consent. Gramsci talked about that the real source of strength of the capitalist society is not found in coercive institutions of the state, but it has to be looked in the realm of civil society, where institutions of civil society, they are the site of manufacturing consent. This hegemony, ideological domination. Okay, so Gramsci talked about how you have to establish the counter hegemony by organic intellectuals, alliance of organic intellectuals, the traditional intellectuals sympathetic to the cause of working class and the subaltern classes. His concept of a social bloc. So Gramsci, as a new Marxist ideology, He also talked about that how there will be first the war of position, there will be first the war of position, and second there will be war of maneuver. And in conclusion, you can simply say, thus we see that this is how political ideologies are primarily concerned with allocation and division of power. In fact, Gramsci built on Marx's ideas where he presented ideology as false consciousness. Okay. So basically this is what you have to write about political ideologies. Okay. And I am sure there is not a single thing, new thing which I have been discussing. And as I tell you often, that if you have read thoroughly, you will all have the ingredients with you. The point is how to connect the dots and how to develop the interlinkages to present the answer. Okay. Now moving on to the next question. If you see 4a, now do you think, if I have to identify the keywords in this question, it talks about, do you think that the Buddhist traditions have lent greater ethical foundation to the ancient Indian political thought? Give your arguments. Now here you have to, if you connect the dots, give your arguments, you have to substantiate whether it lent greater ethical foundations by giving certain plausible points. Okay. Now here the very important keyword I will say is greater ethical foundation. Now greater, what does greater means? Good, better, best, great, greater, greatest. Whenever the term greater comes, it means that obviously there is a comparison involved. Comparison involved with earlier perspectives. Can I say that? Yes. So Buddhist traditions have lent greater ethical foundation to ancient Indian political thought. So here the word greater, it means ethical foundations were already there. How Buddhism added to the ethical foundations which were already present in the ancient political thought. And by that logic, you have to write it with respect to comparative perspective with the earlier perspectives of ancient Indian political thought, that is the Dharma Shastra and the Artha Shastra tradition. This is the demand of the question. And the structure of the answer will be the Buddhist traditions. The question was about Buddhist traditions, and the structure of the answer will be, if I talk about introduction, and remember this is a 20 marks question, so you can be a bit elaborative also. So introduction, main body and conclusion. Introduction, main body and conclusion. Now, introduction, main body and conclusion. In introduction, if I say, the very you can start with the idea of Bhikkhu Parik. Now Bhikkhu Parik, this is Bhikkhu Parik. It is also given material if you see. So Bhikkhu Parik says that the Hindu political thought met its most powerful critique at the hand of Buddhism. Okay, and Buddhism, despite being a religion, it definitely contains many political ideas and Bhikkhu Parik also said that the Buddhist tradition did not lead to a radical reformulation of Hindu thought, but it was many continuities in their thought. And here we find that Buddhism wanted to replace the Brahmin Kshatriya alliance with the Kshatriya Vaishya alliance. Okay, this is about introduction, you can say. Now, as far as main body is concerned, now in main body, here you have to emphasize on the fact that, as I said, the key word here is greater ethical foundation. Keep the key word in mind, greater ethical foundation. And the moment you keep this keyword in mind, the answer will flow while comparing it with Dharma Shastra and the Artha Shastra traditions. Okay. Now, if we talk about the first theme, here I am proceeding in a thematic manner, which you ought to have written in the answer. And trust me, you must have seen everything will be based on the classroom discussions and the material which have been circulated. The point is presentation. How you to weave your answers. Okay. Now here, greater ethical foundation. And greater ethical foundation we find, if we talk about the origin of state, if I talk about the function of the state, if I talk about the characteristic principles, so origin of state, functions of state, the characteristic principles, the three main themes in which you can emphasize how Buddhism provided a greater ethical foundation to Indian political thought. And here we find, now origin of the state, if I talk about Artha Shastra and Dharma Shastra tradition and the Buddhist tradition. Now, so Artha Shastra and Dharma Shastra tradition and Buddhist tradition. I am using this comparative chart for your purpose, but you have to write it in a paragraph manner. Okay. Now here, origin of the state. Now remember, Artha Shastra and the Dharma Shastra tradition. Basically, Dharma Shastra tradition emphasized on the divine origin of the state. The Artha Shastra tradition emphasized on the contractual origin, but Artha Shastra Kautilya particularly said that the king derives its power from the divine blessings. Okay, that was with a purpose to make revolt against the state difficult. Okay, so divine origin to protect from Matsnyaya, like Hobbesian state of nature. Now, Buddhism, when it talked about origin of the state, Buddhism talked about that there was once a glorious society full of virtues. This society gradually degenerated and it was affected with lot of vices. So to protect themselves from the vices like caste system and others, here Buddhism, in Buddhist tradition, basically the people enter into a contract with each other and they elected the most virtuous person as the ruler. That person was known as the Mahasammat. That ruler was known as the Mahasammat. Mahasammat is the great elect, meaning the great elect. So Buddhism emphasized on the contractarian tradition. And Buddhism basically supported republican view, that people elected themselves amongst themselves the most great, the most virtuous ruler. Now this Buddhist text like Digha Nikaya, it emphasizes on the origin of this. Digha Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya, they emphasized on the origin of the state. So here, origin of the state, the king was already the most virtuous person. As far as function of the state is concerned, now Dharmashastra and Arthashastra tradition, they also talked about welfare activities. King has to ensure Raksha, Palan and punish the adharmis, the violators of the dharma. Now here the Jataka contains the idea about the 10 duties of the king, and here Buddha was also Lord Buddha also said about strict punishment acting as a deterrent. So the notion of danda, the notion of the danda and dharma was obviously borrowed from the Hindu tradition. So Buddha had also emphasized that the king's duty was to punish the violators of the law and dharma. But Jatakas also talk about the 10 duties of the king, and among 10 duties Jatakas highlights the virtues which the king should have. For example, the king should live a simple life, the king should be compassionate, the king should care for the welfare of the people, the king should be truthful, etc. So these 10 duties of the king, it added the ethical dimension also. While Manusmriti talked about the balance of power, Kautilya had talked about the imperialist foreign policy. Imperialist foreign policy. Both had talked about the Shadgun Siddhanta, the use of the spies, etc. Now, in Buddhist tradition we find how there was a greater emphasis on ethical aspect. Now, remember Kautilya also had talked about dual morality. The concept of dual morality, that in times of emergency, king is free to take recourse to fraud, chaos, fraud, violence, stratagems, killing, etc. Buddhism did not emphasize on these aspects. Buddhism, in fact, it said, now Buddhism also emphasized on the virtue of a Chakravarti Samrat, Chakravarti king, universal emperor. But that Chakravarti king was to win the world on the basis of his virtues. So he would conquer the world not by arms, but he would conquer the world by his virtues. Buddhism emphasized the principle of righteousness. Buddhism had emphasized the principle of righteousness as the main guiding principle of state's policy, internal as well as external. Remember Buddha's righteousness, which talked about the eightfold path, the Madhyam Marg. What was the righteousness? What is meant by the righteousness? That was also, if you recall, was already included in the material. So principles of righteousness like right belief, right thought, right action, right meditation, this principle of righteousness will be the guiding principles of the state policy. So state will not use of killing, state will not use of spy, etc. Because principle of righteousness was to decide that. Now coming to the characteristic principles of Buddhism. Now these characteristic principles of Buddhism we find. Now in characteristic principles of Buddhism, now Ashoka's Dhamma, you have to write about Ashoka's Dhamma. Now Ashoka's Dhamma added the ideals of peace, non-violence. It added the ideas of peace, non-violence, toleration, non-aggression, etc. So these features were added by Ashoka's Dhamma. Okay, and here Buddha, we have also discussed Ambedkar's view, where Ambedkar had said that Buddha talked about abolition of private property, and this was specifically seen in the working of Sanghas. Now Sanghas, in the working of Sanghas, we find that the notion of equality, the notion of deliberative democracy, democracy was there. Sanghas, the notion of equality, the doors of Sanghas were added to women, to Shudras, to the foreigners who are not included in the fold of Hinduism. The programs and Sanghas were decided after due deliberation. If there was any difference of opinion, it was referred to a committee. There was a system like quorum. So basically means, since all were going to be affected by decision, everybody is entitled to participate. Okay. So these ways, you have to emphasize how Buddhism added the greater ethical foundations to Indian political thought. And you have to give the assessment of the scholars. The assessment of the scholars, we have discussed the views of A.T. Embry. For example, A.T. Embry calls the Buddhist contract theory of the state as one of the earliest contract theory of the state. You can give the views of Rumila Thapar. Now Rumila Thapar, when she talks about Ashoka's Dhamma, Rumila Thapar said that Ashoka's Dhamma was meant to act as a cementing force for the diversity of people and communities which were there in Ashoka's vast empire. Professor M.P. Singh says that obviously this was how ethical principle of righteousness was already emphasized in Buddhist tradition of thought. And in conclusion, we can simply write, how the Buddhist tradition of political thought influenced Gandhi and how they constitute important element of the Panchashil principles as well as Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, which talks about a duty of this, basically a directive principle which talks about how the state should promote international peace and security. Okay, so this is influence of Buddhism, concluding it with not only how it lent a greater ethical foundation, but also how it led to the influence on the modern political thought as well. The next question is about Marx's concept of alienation as an essential part of the reality in capitalism, and explain. The key word here is explain, and that's how in this explanation part you have to basically emphasize on the detailed description of what was Marx's concept of alienation. So if I talk about the appropriate structure for this answer, if I talk about the introduction, if I talk about the main body and conclusion, so introduction, main body and conclusion. Now if I talk about introduction, you can straightaway start with the fact that you can straightway start with Marx's analysis of capitalism. Now Marx's analysis of capitalism. Now in Marx's analysis of capitalism, you simply said that Karl Marx, when he analyzed capitalism, he appreciated the positive aspects of capitalism, like how it promoted urbanization, how it promoted rapid technological development, how it was cosmopolitan in its reach. But at the same time, he was also critical of the exploitative features of capitalism, which was reflected in the concept of surplus value and the which was reflected in the concept of surplus value and the concept of alienation. And here the concept of alienation, Marx said, is the most dehumanizing impact of capitalism. And the concept of alienation was given by young Marx. The concept of alienation was given by young Marx in his book Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. Young Marx was concerned with, he was a humanist. He was concerned with issues of alienation and emancipation. So it was an ethical critique of capitalism, and Marx said alienation is the most dehumanizing impact of capitalism. You have to also discuss about the influence of Marx's influence of ideas of Hegel and Feuerbach on Marx's idea of alienation. Marx was inspired by them. So this is about, you know, alienation, about how his analysis of capitalism, and from that analysis emerges alienation, because the question also says that how it is a reality of the capitalism. Moving on to the main body, you have to you know, define alienation. You have to discuss about the causes of alienation. Define alienation. You have to discuss about causes of alienation. Define alienation. You have to discuss about causes of alienation. You have to discuss about types of alienation. Where in types of alienation, there was alienation of both the worker and alienation of both the capitalists. And then you have to discuss about the solution which was given by Marx as far as alienation is concerned. Now, defining alienation. To define alienation, alienation is basically, you know, the inability of man to realize his nature due to working of capitalism. And alienation is it includes the process of estrangement. It includes a process of estrangement and objectification. How man is estranged from his nature, from himself, and how that objectification also impacts him. And after defining alienation, you have to emphasize on the human essence. What was the human essence according to Marx? And this denial of human essence by capitalism, it led to alienation. Now Marx had said, what is the essence of human beings? Human beings are creative, human beings are multifaceted, human beings are social and cooperative. Labor is a need of human beings. How human beings give vent to their creative energy, and that is reflected in labor. So how, you know, it is a part of man to be productive and objective. Basically, you know, objectify himself through labor. And how, you know, when labor becomes a necessity to satisfy the need other than itself, it becomes a part of alienation. So how capitalism, by working of capitalism, the essence of man is nullified, and this leads to alienation. Okay, so defining alienation as well as the human essence and how the working of capitalism nullifies that. Moving on to causes of alienation. And causes of alienation, which Marx talked about. Causes of alienation is private property and division of labor. Division of labor and specialization of specialization. Private property ensures exploitation, and division of labor and exploitation, it reduces human beings, the multifaceted personality. How alienation is caused? Basically, alienation is of the worker as well as capitalist. Worker, Marx talked about the 4 types of alienation. And in 4 types of alienation, for example, how worker, the first alienation, worker was alienated from his product and product process. Worker was not able to decide what to produce, when to produce. The objects of his labor belonged to somebody else. In fact, his labor belonged to somebody else. So he was alienated from the product and his product process. He was alienated from his nature, the second alienation. How he was alienated from this nature? He did not find any joy, any satisfaction in doing labor. Labor becomes a compulsion. Labor becomes a servitude. Labor becomes a routinized and mechanized activity. He was a cog in the wheel simply. Third dimension of alienation. How? You have to emphasize on how he is alienated from his fellow human beings. because competitive nature of capitalism means that others always they sustain at the cost of the other. So he sees fellow workers as his competitors. As a result of all these three alienations, the fourth alienation happens, that man is alienated from man is alienated from himself. So he finds only he lives to the level of animal existence, and he has no time for indulging in any creative pursuits, literary pursuits. In fact, when talking about division of labor, Marx in his historical materialism had talked about that the sexual division of labor is the first division of labor, and later on the formalized division of labor was between mental and intellectual labor. So as far as capitalist is concerned, the capitalist is also alienated, because the very nature of working of capitalism ensures that he has to exploit the worker for his own survival. This person is obsessed with profit, and freedom in capitalism, it is basically reduced to freedom in capitalism is basically reduced to a freedom of buying things, which Marx called as commodity fetishism. So this way you have to describe about the causes of alienation, the types of alienation, both workers and the capitalist. Solution: the cause. Solution is remove the cause, alienation is removed. So Marx had said the alienation will be removed in a communist society where private property will be abolished, there will be no division of labor and specialization of skills. There will be freedom from necessities. Work will no longer be a compulsion or servitude, but man will find his fulfillment in doing creative labor. He can develop his multifaceted personality. And how Marx had said that labor will be rewarding satisfactorily. It will be an inner satisfaction of the man when he does the labor in communist society. History to develop all aspects of his personality. So Marx had said that there will not be any specialization of the skills, and Marx said a worker can hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear capital in the evening, and be a literary critic in the dinner at the dinner time without specializing in any of these things. So this is why you have to explain in detail what was Marx's alienation. So these are the broad themes which you are expected to incorporate in your answer. I am sure all these themes were there in the material, you can see, as well as the way we had explained it in the class. The last question is, if I say, now the last question talks about now free and fair deliberation. It talks about free and fair deliberation is the key to foundation of democracy. Again, the keyword is explained. So you have to write in detail about this idea. Now in this statement, if I have to identify the keywords, free and fair deliberation, foundation, democracy, explain, the four keywords. The moment you link the keywords, the moment you understand the keywords, it automatically becomes clear that the question is nothing but about deliberative democracy. The question is about deliberative democracy. So how deliberative democracy, how deliberation becomes a foundation of democracy? So you have to basically write about deliberative democracy. Now when you have to write about deliberative democracy, what shall be the introduction, main body and conclusion? Let us see that. Now, as far as introduction is concerned, this introduction, the main body and conclusion is concerned. Now, in introduction, you have to write about, in introduction basically you have to write about, you have to define deliberative democracy straight away. Define deliberative democracy, as well as you have to also mention the context of its emergence. Now, deliberative democracy, context of its emergence and the influence, we can say. Now, defining deliberative democracy, deliberative democracy basically says that, the political decisions should be based on. Deliberative democracy is that model of democracy which emphasizes that political deliberation should be based on fair and reasonable deliberation among the citizens. Simple definition of simple definition of deliberative democracy: political decisions should be based on fair and reasonable deliberation among the citizens. And it basically emphasizes that, democracy is a transformative process. It says democracy is a transformative process that requires citizens' participation in authentic deliberation. So that is the definition of deliberative democracy. The term deliberative democracy, it was basically coined by Joseph Bassett in 1980. It was coined by Joseph Bassett in 1980, and the context of its emergence was the dissatisfaction. The context of its emergence was the dissatisfaction with the procedural theory of democracy or the aggregative model of democracy. The aggregative model of democracy, which considers voting as the end all of democracy. It says no, democracy is not about voting in the elections. Democracy means that whatever decisions has to be taken, it is to be the result of fair and free deliberation among the people. So basically, this context of emergence was a dissatisfaction with the aggregative model of democracy. And that's how they say that, this aggregative model of democracy, it fails to give emphasis to effective participation of the people and enlightened understanding of the people, because it considers voting process as the end of the democracy. So this is about the introduction which you have to write about the deliberative democracy. Coming to the main body, and main body you have to write about the features of deliberative democracy as well as views of scholars. Views of scholars, I can say, like Habermas, views of scholars like Gutman and Thompson, views of scholars like Fishkin and Ackerman, etc. Now, influence, obviously they are inspired by the Athenian model of deliberative democracy. Is inspired by the Athenian model, where in Athens there was a vibrant participatory democracy and all decisions were taken after due deliberation among the people. Now, features of deliberative democracy, obviously the name suggests, and the question also asks, that it stands for free and fair deliberation. Okay. Now here deliberative democracy says that people's preference, if I talk about features, it talks about people's preference. Now it says that people's preference is formed not prior to the democratic process. People's preference is formed during the political process when they participate and deliberate with each other. So people's preference is formed within the deliberative process, it says. It also talks about the equality amongst the participants. Equality amongst the participants, that basically if participation has to be real and effective, people will be given widest opportunity to participate in the deliberative process. Okay. And here it talks about that the true spirit of democracy, is basically represented by freedom of speech and expression. Freedom of speech and expression. The true spirit of democracy, it represents freedom of speech and expression, where people can go for deliberation which is free and fair, unrestrained. And here you have to emphasize how Mill had even supported the freedom of speech and expression. Mill had also talked about Parliament to be a deliberative body. Okay, so this true spirit of democracy is represented by freedom of speech and expression, and here it says that the primary source of legitimacy is the accountability of the government, where government has to justify its policies, programs. It has to explain its policies and programs to the people. And it talks about a division of labor. Deliberative democracy talks about a division of labor among the professional politicians and the people, where people will supplement the politicians' effort by reasoned deliberation. Okay, so this way it is a feature of basically the feature of deliberative democracy. And if I talk about the views of the scholars, now Habermas basically says the legitimacy of any political decision is based on the assent of the people, which is an outcome of deliberation in an ideal speech situation. Outcome of deliberation in an ideal speech situation. Ideal speech situation means where people participate in the deliberation process without any discrepancies of power. It means free and fair deliberation. Every member is entitled to express his views. Gutman and Thompson, they emphasize on three features of deliberative democracy. Three features of deliberative democracy. They say it is a reciprocity. Emphasize on it is a reciprocity, accountability, and publicity. How? While participating with each other, you get to know about the other side of the argument, how there is a mutual give and take among the people, and how it enlightens our understanding. So basically this enlightened understanding as far as common good is concerned can only be done through the result of the deliberative democracy. In fact, John Rawls also talked about the deliberation behind the will of ignorance to arrive at the principles of justice. Hannah Arendt, in her concept of political action, where she talks about speech and action, the coherence between action and speech. That's what speech basically means: deliberation, expression of the different viewpoints. And here Ackerman and Fishkin and Ackerman, for example, they emphasize on the concept of a deliberation day, that just a week before election a deliberation day shall be fixed. They also support the idea of paying people for the deliberation activities. Now, having said that, you have to also discuss briefly what are the benefits of deliberation and benefits of deliberative democracy. If you see in the material, it says public deliberation has many benefits for the society. It results in giving respect to reasoning rather than opinion. It results in better policy. It furthers public education. It increases public trust. Reduces conflict, greater chance of widely shared consensus. It promotes sympathy with opposing views. It provides legitimacy to the system. I'd use the word public consultation as one of the tools of legitimacy of the state that is represented here. And it strengthens citizens' voice in governance by including people of all classes and races. It also includes marginalized, isolated and ignored groups. So that is what is inclusive approach of deliberative democracy. Free and fair. The term used is free and fair. So it is inclusive. It provides everybody opportunity. So this is what you had to write as far as views of the scholars is concerned and the benefits. So in main body, you have to write about the features, you have to write about views of scholars, you have to also write about the benefits of deliberative democracy. Now coming to the conclusion part. Now conclusion part you find that basically you can conclude that deliberative model of democracy tries to overcome the shortcomings of the aggregate model of democracy, and it has enriched the concept of democracy. Simple. Okay. So this way, all the 4 questions which I had discussed, you will find that these questions were already the part of, all these questions, the material were already there with you, the way it was taught to you in the class, so attempting questions would have been easy for you. So basically this is what we had, and I hope you will be satisfied with the way your confidence builds up after going through the class notes and the material and the way it has been explained. So point is that what matters is your presentation, how you are going to weave the different concepts, and that how you are going to address the demand of the question. That only will help you to do justice to the how the question has been asked, do justice to the examination, and that will help you in understanding. Okay, so we'll stop here, and I hope this was beneficial for you. Okay, thank you all.